When the sun sank below the Cretaceous horizon, darkness did not bring silence. A hidden world stirred in the shadows. As tyrannosaurs and other giant predators drifted into slumber, a new caste of hunters emerged, small, with enormous eyes and razor claws, perfectly engineered for the night. You might think it was safe to sleep, but the dinosaur herds never truly slept soundly. Tonight, we slip into this ancient night shift. How did nocturnal predators silently stalk sleeping hadrosaurs and raid unguarded nests? What made Truden's vision so sharp in the dark? And why does this forgotten nocturnal ecology still echo inside your own brain? Let's find out. Welcome to the late Cretaceous, about 70 million years ago. The world is warmer, the continents are taking their modern shape, and the sun has just vanished below a fern-choked horizon. In the daylight hours, this landscape belonged to the giants. Tyrannosaurs patrolled the open plains, massive hadrosaurs grazed in herds of thousands, and the air thrummed with the wingbeats of pterosaurs the size of small planes. But when that fiery Cretaceous sun dropped, an invisible emergency brake released across the food chain. The apex daytime predators had a fatal flaw. Their eyes were built for light. In near total darkness, a tyrannosaur was effectively blind, so they slept. And as they slept, a second evolutionary masterpiece clocked in for its shift. What emerged from the undergrowth was not a scaled-down version of the day hunters, but an entirely different blueprint. Small theropods, some no taller than a turkey, with enormous eyes that bulged from narrow skulls, teeth like serrated needles, and a brain-to-body ratio that rivaled modern crows. Their feet carried a sickle claw they could flick forward to puncture a throat in a single silent motion. They hunted not by brute force, but by calculation, coordination, and senses turned up to 11. The sleepy hadrosaurs standing in the dark, juveniles pressed to the center of the herd for safety. Eggs resting in shallow nests under the stars. None of them were safe. The night hunters were already moving, and the sleeping world never knew they were there until it was far too late. This is a story about the dinosaur age that paleontologists are only now piecing together. Using cutting-edge scans of fossil eye sockets, comparative anatomy with modern owls, and high-resolution trace fossils, we can reconstruct exactly how a midnight ambush unfolded. What did these predators see that the rest of the Mesozoic world missed? How did intelligence evolve as a weapon of the dark? And what does it mean for you, right now, that the brain you use to process this sentence shares a deep ancestral link with dinosaur stalkers that hunted in moonlight? Because the legacy of the Cretaceous night shift didn't go extinct. It just got smarter. So let's step into the dark. Let's say you are standing in a forest clearing in what will one day be southern Alberta, 70 million years ago. The air is thick and warm, even now, hours after sunset. The ground beneath your feet is spongy with moss and rotting ferns. Around you, enormous conifers rise like dark cathedral columns, their branches blocking out the stars. A low mist rolls through the undergrowth, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something animal and heavy. In the distance, you can just make out a series of dark, gently swaying shapes. A herd of hadrosaurs, 40, maybe 50 of them, each one the size of a city bus. They are standing upright, packed close together, their long necks drooping down as they sleep. The juveniles are in the center, pressed between the massive flanks of the adults. The whole herd breathes in slow unison. It looks peaceful. It looks safe. It is neither. If you could scan the forest with infrared vision, you'd see what the hadrosaurs cannot. In every direction, the undergrowth is peppered with small, hot bodies, each radiating heat like a hidden ember. The night shift has already deployed. A troodon freezes mid-step, one clawed foot suspended above a dry fern frond. Its head, no larger than a human hand, swivels slowly on a slender neck. Its enormous eyes, amber-colored, with vertically slit pupils that could swallow the moon, focus on a single juvenile hadrosaur at the outer edge of the herd. That juvenile is breathing deeply, its head drooping low, in a phase of sleep so deep it borders on unconsciousness. The Troodon has been waiting for exactly this moment. Now, to understand what happens next, you have to rewire everything you think you know about the dinosaur world. Because the Cretaceous night wasn't just a quiet pause between battles. It was its own ecosystem, a parallel realm with a different caste, different rules, and a different evolutionary arms race that had been running in the dark for tens of millions of years. And the central weapon in that arms race was vision. Not just good vision, hyper-specialized, low-light vision that makes a cat's eyes look like cheap reading glasses. Paleontologists can now measure this with startling precision. They do it by studying something called the scleral ring, a circle of tiny bones that sits inside the eyeball of birds, reptiles, and yes, dinosaurs. By measuring the diameter of that ring and comparing it to the overall eye socket, scientists can calculate exactly how much light an eye could take in. It's the fossil equivalent of reading a camera's aperture specs. And when they applied this technique to Troodon, the numbers jumped off the chart. The eye sockets of Troodon were enormous relative to its skull. In fact, the openings for its eyes were proportionally larger than those of any other known dinosaur. Reconstructions suggest that a Troodon's eyes could gather as much ambient light as a modern barn owl, which can spot a mouse in near total darkness from 50 feet away. But Troodon wasn't hunting mice. It was hunting animals dozens of times its own weight, animals that could crush it with a single panicked kick if they woke up. So vision alone wasn't enough. The night hunters needed another edge, and that edge was coordination. Enter Stenotikosaurus, a close relative of Troodon that lived slightly further north. Fossil trackways discovered in British Columbia, dozens of three-toed footprints crisscrossing the same patch of mud in patterns that overlap but never clash, suggest these predators moved in small, tightly synchronized groups. The spacing of the footprints indicates they walked in single file, then fanned out into a crescent formation around their prey. This is not random scavenging. This is a tactical envelopment executed in near silence, in the pitch black, by animals with a brain-to-body ratio higher than any other dinosaurs except modern birds. Their brains were, in relative terms, larger than those of the daytime predators they lived alongside. The troodontids were, to use the technical paleontological term, scary smart. But smart how? What does intelligence look like in a 70-million-year-old nocturnal hunter? The brain of a troodon, as reconstructed from CT scans of fossil skulls, shows an expanded cerebrum and enlarged optic lobes. That means a huge portion of its neural real estate was dedicated to processing visual information in real time and making split-second decisions based on that data. This wasn't just a reflex machine. It was a calculating system that could read a herd, identify the weak point, and wait for the precise moment when attention lapsed and muscles went slack. If you've ever watched a pack of wolves work the edge of a bison herd, you've seen a ghost of this ancient algorithm. But the wolves are noisy, and the bison are awake. The hadrosaurs were not. The night hunters exploited a vulnerability so basic it almost feels cruel. The simple fact that even a giant must sleep eventually. And when it does, for roughly 15% of its slumber, it enters REM sleep, the stage where the body paralyzes itself and the mind descends into dreams. That's the window. That's the moment when the troodon's foot finally touches the soil and the charge begins. But here is the thing that keeps paleontologists up at night. Troodon and Stenotikosaurus weren't the only predators working the dark shift. Not by a long shot. Further south, in the Gobi Desert of what would become Mongolia, another hunter was refining its own approach to the night. Velociraptor. Yes, the same velociraptor that Hollywood turned into a human-sized pack-hunting monster was, in reality, a turkey-sized crepuscular and nocturnal predator. Fossil evidence from the famous fighting dinosaurs specimen, a velociraptor locked in combat with a protoceratops, tells us something remarkable. The position of the fossils, buried in a sand dune collapse, suggests the fight happened at dusk or dawn. And when researchers analyzed the scleral rings of Velociraptor, they found a pattern consistent with animals that are most active during low-light transitions, the twilight hours when day bleeds into night. Velociraptor wasn't just a night hunter. It was a hunter of the seams, the liminal spaces between worlds, when the light is sliding and the eye struggles to track movement. If Troodon was the silent assassin of the deep night, Velociraptor was the ambush predator of the gathering shadow, the thing that struck just as the herd was settling down or just beginning to stir. And yet, as formidable as these predators were, the night didn't belong to them alone. The sleeping world pushed back in ways we're only now beginning to understand. Hadrosaurs, for all their apparent vulnerability, were not helpless. Their hearing, as reconstructed from detailed CT scans of their skulls, was astonishingly acute. The hadrosaur ear could detect frequencies far below the range of human hearing, infrasound that travels through the ground and rises through the bones of the feet. A troodontid footstep, no matter how carefully placed, sent a seismic ripple through the soil. The herd's communication network was always on, even in sleep. At the first tremor of a coordinated approach, the adults could snap awake and slam their massive tails into the darkness with enough force to shatter bone. One wrong step for a troodon meant a broken leg. A broken leg meant a slow death. The stakes in the Cretaceous night were always life and death for both sides. But let's return to that clearing, to that juvenile hadrosaur, the one at the edge of the herd, breathing slow. The troodon has been waiting, its sickle claw already lifted into position. The rest of its pack, 3, maybe 4 others, are angled in a semicircle, hidden behind cycads and fallen logs. The moment is so close. The juvenile exhales, long and low, and just as the troodon tenses every muscle fiber to spring forward, something moves in the canopy above. Another hunter has arrived, one with a very different set of tools, and it's been watching the same target from above. The night shift just got a lot more crowded, and the real hunt is about to begin. The canopy hunter was not a troodon. It was something else entirely, a creature that had evolved to exploit the darkness not from the ground, but from above. If you could crane your neck and peer up into the gnarled branches of that Cretaceous conifer, you would see a pair of enormous forward-facing eyes staring down, unblinking, reflecting the faintest starlight like twin coins of cold fire. This was a small arboreal dromaeosaur, a cousin of the raptors, no heavier than a raven, but with a set of adaptations so specialized that it could cling to vertical bark in complete silence and drop onto its prey with the accuracy of a falling stone. Its arms were long and feathered, its tail stiffened into a rudder for mid-air steering. It had been watching the same juvenile hadrosaur for over an hour. The troodon pack below had no idea it was there. The Cretaceous night was full of these overlaps, predator upon predator, niche upon niche, all separated not by walls, but by time, space, and sensory bandwidth. To understand how a sleeping herd could survive such a stacked deck, you have to leave that single clearing and pull back far enough to see the entire nocturnal ecosystem for what it really was. A three-dimensional battlefield where the ground, the trees, and the air all had their own assigned hunters, their own kings of the dark. The troodon owned the forest floor, the arboreal dromaeosaur owned the canopy, and somewhere above the treetops, silhouetted against the Cretaceous moon, the wings of a small nocturnal pterosaur would occasionally blot out the stars as it scanned the clearings below for anything small and unwary. The night shift had layers. Let's start with the ground hunters, because they were the most sophisticated. The troodontids were not just one species. Across the northern hemisphere, from the floodplains of Alberta to the coastal swamps of Alaska, at least half a dozen closely related small theropods shared this basic body plan. Lightweight build, three-toed feet with a retractable killing claw, narrow jaws lined with small pointed teeth, and eyes so large they distorted the shape of the skull. But each species had its own twist on the formula. In Alaska, where the winter darkness could last for months, a still unnamed troodontid has been described from fragmentary remains that show even larger eye sockets than its southern relatives. The further north you go, the less light there is for half the year, and evolution responded by opening the aperture wider. These Alaskan night hunters may have been active in conditions so dim that a modern human would be functionally blind. They lived in a world of twilight and shadow that we can barely imagine. In Alberta, where our juvenile hadrosaur is taking its last deep sleep before the ambush, another species held dominion over a slightly different niche. Stenonychosaurus, sometimes called the narrow claw, was built for speed and precision. Its legs were longer relative to its body than Troodon's, suggesting it could sprint through the undergrowth in short, explosive bursts. Its teeth were more robust, its jaws slightly deeper, adaptations for a diet that included not only fresh meat but eggs, insects, and perhaps even the soft new growth of cycads. This was an opportunist, a nocturnal generalist that could switch between hunting strategies depending on what the darkness provided. Fossilized stomach contents from one specimen in Montana reveal a jumble of small bones, lizard scales, and crushed eggshell fragments. This creature didn't just hunt sleeping dinosaurs, it raided nests. It snatched sleeping pterosaurs from their perches. It dug up buried prey with its foreclaws and swallowed it whole. The night was its buffet, but the troodontids had a problem, one that becomes obvious when you watch a modern nocturnal predator in action. Owls have a secret weapon that dinosaurs lacked: asymmetrical ears. An owl's skull is warped, one ear opening higher than the other, so that sound arrives at each ear at a slightly different time and angle. This allows an owl to triangulate the location of a mouse under a foot of snow with lethal precision, even in total darkness. Troodon did not have this. Its ears, as far as we can tell from the fossil skulls, were symmetrical, which means that while its night vision was exceptional, its hearing was not. It could see in the dark, but it could not hear in the dark. Not with owl-level precision, and that limitation shaped everything about how it hunted. It had to rely on sight. It had to get close enough to see the rise and fall of a ribcage, the flicker of an eyelid, the subtle shift of weight from one leg to another. It had to wait until the moon was right, until the clouds parted, until the ambient light was just enough to paint a target on the side of a sleeping giant. And then it had to move fast before the light changed again. The troodontids were visual specialists in a world where vision could fail at any moment, so they compensated with intelligence. The larger brain of Troodon, with its expanded cerebrum and optic lobes, was not just about processing images. It was about building a mental model of the environment that persisted even when the lights went out. This is called spatial memory, and it's one of the hallmarks of higher cognition. A troodon that had scouted a herd earlier in the evening, when the last light of dusk still lingered, could remember exactly where each juvenile was positioned, which ones were smaller, which ones were limping, which ones had drifted too far from the adults. It could plan a route through the undergrowth that avoided dry leaves and snapping twigs, a route it had memorized hours earlier when it could still see. And then, in the dark, it could execute that plan from memory, moving through the blackness like a chess player who has already won the game in their head and is simply playing out the moves. This was not instinct. This was cognition. This was a brain solving a multivariable problem in real time under life or death pressure. But here's the thing about intelligence. It doesn't evolve in a vacuum. It evolves in response to a challenge, and the challenge of the Cretaceous night was not just the darkness. It was the prey, because the hadrosaurs, for all their sleepy vulnerability, were not dumb bundles of meat. They were the product of their own evolutionary arms race. one that had been running for over 100 million years before Troodon ever set foot in that clearing. And the hadrosaurs had developed a suite of countermeasures that made hunting them at night anything but easy. Let's focus on that herd for a moment. If you could walk among them, weaving between their tree trunk legs, you'd notice the first line of defense: their skin. Hadrosaur hide was thick, leathery, and covered in a mosaic of tiny scales interspersed with larger tubercles that acted like natural chainmail. A Troodon's bite, no matter how well placed, would not easily penetrate the hide of a healthy adult. The juveniles were softer, more vulnerable, but they were shielded by the adults' bodies. A Troodon needed to find a gap in the armor, the throat, the soft underbelly, the thin skin behind the knee joint, and it needed to find it in the dark, on a moving target, without waking the rest of the herd. If it bit the wrong spot, its teeth would skid off leathery hide. The hadrosaur would wake with a bellow that could shake the forest, and the hunt would be over. Worse, the hunter could become the hunted. A cornered hadrosaur could rear up on its hind legs and come crashing down with both front feet, delivering a blow that could shatter the spine of any predator smaller than a tyrannosaur. So the Troodon had to be precise, surgical. Its sickle claw, the famous killing claw shared by all dromaeosaurs and their relatives, was not a slashing weapon. That is a Hollywood myth. The claw was narrow, curved, and sharp at the tip, designed for piercing, not ripping. It was an ice pick, not a sword. A Troodon would leap onto its prey, dig the claw into a soft spot, and hang on while its teeth went to work on the throat. The entire attack, from first contact to fatal bite, would have lasted a few seconds. If it took longer, the hadrosaur would shake it off, and the moment would be lost. The troodontids were the special forces of the dinosaur world: small teams, precise strikes, minimal engagement time, maximum damage. But precision requires communication. And communication in the dark, without giving away your position to the prey, requires a level of coordination that implies a social structure more complex than anything we've given dinosaurs credit for. How did a pack of Troodons signal each other in the dark? Did they use soft calls, too low for the hadrosaurs to hear? Did they use body language, the pale light glinting off an eye or a raised feather crest? Did they have a leader, an alpha hunter, that initiated the attack? Or was the decision made collectively through some kind of consensus building we can only guess at? We don't know. The fossil record doesn't preserve behavior. But we can extrapolate from modern pack-hunting birds and reptiles. Crows hunt in mobs, coordinating their attacks on larger birds with caws and postures. Crocodiles, their more distant relatives, hunt in groups and communicate with low-frequency rumbles. It is not a stretch to imagine that Troodon, with its large brain and complex visual processing, had evolved a communication system that allowed silent coordination in the dark. Perhaps a flick of the tail, a tilt of the head, a subtle change in posture that said, "Now." The one on the left, the juvenile hadrosaur at the edge of the herd, shifted its weight. One of its legs twitched, a dream spasm. The Troodon pack leader, the one who had been waiting the longest, raised its tail in a slow arc. A signal. The semicircle of bodies in the underbrush tensed. The ambush had reached its critical moment. But then, from above, a soft rustle. The arboreal dromaeosaur had made its move. The thing about the canopy hunter is that it had evolved for a completely different kind of attack. Its body was built around gravity. It didn't need to sprint or leap. It just needed to let go. And when it did, it fell through 10 feet of air in near total silence, its feathered arms spread just enough to steer, its eyes locked on the same juvenile the Troodons had selected. This was not a coincidence. The arboreal hunter had been watching the ground hunters as well. It knew what they were planning, and it had decided to steal their prize. The collision, when it came, was not between predator and prey, but between predator and predator. The arboreal dromaeosaur slammed into the back of the Troodon pack leader just as it began its sprint. The two small dinosaurs tumbled into the leaf litter, a thrashing knot of claws and feathers and snapping jaws. The sound was immediate and catastrophic. A high-pitched screech, the crack of branches, the thud of two bodies hitting a tree root, and the juvenile hadrosaur snapped awake. Its head came up, its eyes wide, its nostrils flaring as it sucked in air to release the alarm. Within seconds, the entire herd was awake, and 60 tons of panicked dinosaur began to move. The stampede that followed was not a coordinated retreat. It was a wave of pure kinetic chaos. Hadrosaurs that had been standing motionless moments before now wheeled and crashed through the undergrowth, their tails sweeping in wide arcs, their feet shaking the ground like a continuous drumroll. The troodons scattered. The arboreal dromaeosaur disentangled itself from its opponent and shot back up a tree trunk with the speed of a frightened squirrel. The juvenile hadrosaur that had been the target was now surrounded by 6 adults, each one bellowing a low-frequency warning that vibrated through the soil. The hunt had failed. The night shift, for all its precision and planning, had been disrupted by a single miscalculation. But here is the twist. In the Cretaceous night, a failed hunt was not just a disappointment. It was a resource transfer. The commotion of the stampede attracted other predators, larger ones that had been sleeping themselves, but whose ears were tuned to the sound of panic. And on the distant ridge, a pair of small tyrannosaurs, not the giants of the day, but a smaller, faster species adapted to the forest's edge, raised their heads and began to move toward the noise. The night shift had tiers, and the top tier had just been alerted. The stampede eventually slowed. The herd reformed half a mile away, the adults forming a protective ring around the juveniles, their breath pluming in the cool night air. No one had been killed, but the energy cost of the panic was enormous. Every hadrosaur in that herd had just burned thousands of calories in a 30-second sprint, calories that would have to be replaced by extra hours of feeding the next day. And the troodons, still scattered, still hungry, had nothing to show for their hours of waiting. They would have to find another opportunity, and soon. A predator that fails too many hunts in a row weakens, and a weakened predator becomes prey itself. The night was not generous. It did not give second chances. It simply presented opportunities, and the cost of missing them was slow starvation. This is the reality that drove the evolution of the night hunter's brain. The pressure was not just to succeed, but to succeed consistently. Night after night, in conditions that shifted with the clouds and the moon phase and the unpredictable movements of the herds. A troodon that failed one hunt could try again. A troodon that failed 10 hunts in a row did not live to try an 11th. The selection pressure for intelligence, for memory, for the ability to predict where a herd would settle and which juveniles would be vulnerable, was relentless and unforgiving. And this pressure did not just sculpt the troodons. It sculpted their entire evolutionary lineage, which leads directly to the birds that fill our skies today. But let's look beyond this single clearing, beyond this single failed hunt in Alberta, and examine the global scope of the nocturnal dinosaur world. Because what was happening in North America was also happening, with different players, on every continent. In what is now Mongolia's Gobi Desert, the night belonged to Velociraptor and its relatives. In Europe, small nocturnal theropods like Varoraptor hunted the sleeping sauropods on the islands of the ancient Tethys Sea. In South America, the Unenlagids, a southern group of dromaeosaurs, patrolled the Patagonian darkness, their prey the small ornithopods that bedded down in the fern prairies. And in all these places, the same evolutionary pressures were at work. Bigger eyes, larger brains, sharper senses, more complex social behaviors. The night shift was not a local phenomenon. It was a global evolutionary laboratory, running parallel experiments on every landmass, and the results of those experiments are written in the bones we are still pulling out of the ground. One of the most extraordinary of these parallel experiments comes from the Gobi. Here, in the Jadoshta Formation, paleontologists have found one of the most famous fossils in the world, the fighting dinosaurs. A velociraptor and a protoceratops, locked together in mortal combat, buried alive by a collapsing sand dune. The position of the bodies tells us that the fight was active when the dune came down. The velociraptor's sickle claw is embedded in the throat of the protoceratops. The protoceratops's beak is clamped around the velociraptor's arm. Both died at the same moment, in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. But what time of day was it? The analysis of the scleral rings of Velociraptor, published in the journal Science in 2011, gives us the answer. The eye structure of Velociraptor is consistent with animals that are most active during crepuscular hours, dawn and dusk. The light levels at the time of the fight were probably low, the sun just rising or just setting, the desert caught in that hazy transition between day and night. This was not a daytime ambush under a bright sun. This was a clash in the gathering shadows, the kind of encounter that happens on the boundary between two worlds. And the Protoceratops? Its eye structure tells a different story. Protoceratops appears to have been cathemeral, active in short bursts throughout both day and night. It could function at any hour, which means that Velociraptor, the crepuscular specialist, was specifically targeting a prey animal that never fully went to sleep. The arms race was not just between predator and prey, but between the activity patterns of both. The predator was trying to carve out a temporal niche where it had an advantage, the low light when its big eyes gave it an edge over the smaller-eyed Protoceratops. The prey, in response, had evolved to be unpredictable, to never be fully off guard, to be ready to fight back at any hour. And when the sand dune came down, it captured that exact moment of the arms race in action. This fossil, this single piece of rock, is the Rosetta Stone of the nocturnal dinosaur world. It tells us that the night shift was not a peaceful niche where clever predators quietly picked off sleeping prey. It was a hotly contested theater of evolution where every advantage was countered. Every specialization met with a counter-specialization. The prey did not simply lay down and wait to be eaten. It evolved to fight back, and the darkness, far from being a refuge for predators, was often a trap of their own making. Stalk too close, and the prey wakes up. Strike too fast, and the herd panics. Miss your target and a larger predator hears the commotion and comes to investigate. The night was a tightrope, and the troodontids were walking it every hour of their waking lives. But perhaps the most haunting piece of the puzzle comes not from the predators, but from a tiny, unassuming dinosaur that lived at the very end of the Cretaceous, just before the asteroid hit. Its name is Shuvuia deserti. It was discovered in Mongolia, in the same formation that produced Velociraptor. And it is, without any exaggeration, one of the strangest dinosaurs ever found. Shuvuia was small, no bigger than a chicken. Its skull was delicate and bird-like, with a long, slender snout. Its teeth were tiny, almost vestigial, and its arms were bizarre, short, powerfully muscled, ending in a single enormous claw. For years, paleontologists were baffled. What did this animal do? What was that claw for? Then, in 2021, a team of researchers led by Jonah Choinière published a study that changed everything. They had performed high-resolution CT scans of the skull of Shuvuia, and what they found inside was a sensory apparatus that rivals anything alive today. The inner ear of Shuvuia was massively enlarged, with a cochlea so long and coiled that it looked like something from a barn owl. The canals of the vestibular system, the part of the inner ear that controls balance and spatial orientation, were also expanded, and the bony rings that once housed the eyes were enormous. This tiny dinosaur had the hearing of an owl and the night vision of a nightjar. It was a nocturnal specialist of the most extreme kind, a creature that had pushed the limits of sensory evolution to their absolute edge. But here is the twist. Shuvuia was not a predator of sleeping dinosaurs. It was an insectivore. That single enormous claw, once thought to be for digging up ants like a modern anteater, was probably used to tear into rotting logs and peel back bark to expose grubs and beetles. Shibuya was hunting the smallest prey imaginable, in total darkness, using a combination of superhearing and supervision that allowed it to detect the faint rustle of a beetle larva under 2 inches of wood. And the fact that it evolved all of these extreme adaptations tells us something crucial about the Cretaceous night. It tells us that the darkness was so crowded, so full of competing species, that the only way to survive was to specialize into the narrowest possible niche. The night was not an empty frontier waiting to be colonized. It was a saturated ecosystem where every available resource was being exploited by something with giant eyes and a finely tuned brain. This is where the story of the nocturnal dinosaurs turns from a spectacle into a revelation. Because Shibuya, Troodon, Stenonychosaurus, Velociraptor, all of them belong to the same broad evolutionary group, the Maniraptoran theropods. This is the group that gave rise to birds. When you look at a Troodon skull, you are not just looking at a dinosaur. You are looking at a close cousin of the creatures that would one day take to the skies. The big brain, the enormous eyes, the complex sensory processing, these are not just adaptations for the night. They are the very adaptations that, in a different configuration, would make flight possible. The ancestors of modern birds were nocturnal. The first avians, the ones that survived the asteroid impact and inherited the world, were creatures of the shadows. The day belonged to the pterosaurs, the giant theropods, the sprawling herbivores, but the night belonged to the small, the clever, the quick. And when the asteroid struck and the planet plunged into a years-long darkness, it was the night shift that was already adapted for the end of the world. But that is a story for later. Right now, we are still in the clearing, still in the aftermath of a failed hunt. The Troodons have regrouped at a safe distance. They are silent, their energy reserves ticking down. The herd is far away, but the night is still young. There will be other opportunities. The question is whether they will find them before dawn, or whether they will still be hungry when the sun rises and the day shift reclaims the world. And that question, that knife-edge balance between success and starvation, is what drove the evolution of the most sophisticated brain the dinosaur world ever produced. A brain that could plan, remember, adapt, and, in some form we may never fully understand, perhaps even think. The night hunters were not just killing machines. They were problem solvers, and the problem they had to solve next was one they had never faced before. Because the pair of tyrannosaurs that had been drawn by the stampede were getting closer, and they were not picky about what they ate. The tyrannosaurs were not giants, not compared to their famous cousin Tyrannosaurus rex. These were members of a smaller, more gracile branch of the tyrannosaur family tree, Albertosaurines, perhaps a species of Gorgosaurus, each one about 25 feet long from snout to tail and weighing just under 2 tons. But in the dark, size is relative. To a Troodon that stood knee-high and weighed less than 100 pounds, a 2-ton predator with a mouth full of serrated teeth was the apocalypse, and the apocalypse was heading directly toward them. The thing about the Tyrannosaur's sense of smell is that it was legendary. Fossilized skulls show olfactory bulbs that were proportionally enormous, rivaling those of modern turkey vultures. A tyrannosaur could smell blood from miles away, could track the scent trail of a panicked herd through dense forest, could detect the subtle chemical signatures of stress hormones, sweat, and fear sweat from hadrosaurs, and now the blood from the arboreal dromaeosaur's collision with the Troodon pack leader. Something was bleeding in that clearing. Not a lot, just a few drops, a scrape from the tumble. It didn't matter. To the tyrannosaur's noses, it was a dinner bell. They moved through the forest with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew they were the biggest things in the dark, their strides long and silent, their heads low, their eyes not as big as a Troodon's, but big enough, fixed on the direction of the scent. The Troodons froze. Not the freezing of stealth, but the freezing of prey. Their own sensory world, built for hunting, was now screaming a different alert. They could hear the tyrannosaurs now, the soft crunch of pine needles, the occasional snap of a twig, the low, rhythmic exhale of huge lungs. The forest, moments ago a hunting ground, had become a trap. The Troodons had a choice: scatter into the undergrowth, each for themselves, or attempt to slip away together, using their knowledge of the terrain to lose the much larger predators. Scattering was safer for the majority. The tyrannosaurs could only follow one scent trail, maybe two. But it meant abandoning the pack, abandoning the hunt, and facing the rest of the night alone. Staying together meant risking a group ambush, but also preserving the social bond that made them such effective hunters. Evolution had not prepared them for this specific dilemma. It had only prepared them to make a decision, fast, under pressure, with incomplete information. Just like before, the pack leader, the same one that had raised its tail to signal the ambush, made its choice. It turned away from the tyrannosaurs toward the deepest part of the forest and began to move. Not a sprint, but a silent glide through the ferns. One by one, the others followed. They did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for prey that had already escaped, and they had not escaped yet. The column of Troodons dissolved into the shadows, their footfalls so soft that even the infrasound-sensitive hadrosaurs might not have registered them. The tyrannosaurs entered the clearing a few minutes later. They found the disturbed leaf litter, the scent of blood, the lingering warmth of the Troodons' bodies in the soil. They sniffed the air, turning their massive heads slowly, scanning the tree line. One of them opened its jaws slightly, tasting the night, but the Troodons were already gone. The tyrannosaurs would not follow. They were not built for the dense undergrowth of the deep forest. They were edge hunters, creatures of the margins. And so, after a few minutes of investigation, they moved on, heading toward the distant sound of the reformed hadrosaur herd. The stampede had promised an injured juvenile. That was a bigger prize. The Troodons had survived, but the hunt was over. The energy they had spent waiting, the calories they had burned in the sprint, and the fight with the arboreal dromaeosaur, the stress of the close call with the tyrannosaurs, all of it had drained their reserves. They would need to find food before dawn, or their bodies would begin to cannibalize their own muscle. The night shift was unforgiving, but it was also long. The Cretaceous night, even near the equator, could stretch for 10, 11 hours. That was enough time to find another herd, another nest, another sleeping animal. It had to be. There was no alternative. But here is what makes the Troodon situation more than just a story of one bad night. It's a window into the brutal economics of nocturnal predation, an economics that, over millions of years, shaped the very architecture of the brain. And to understand that, we have to leave Alberta entirely and travel to a different night on a different continent, where the stakes were even higher and the predators even more specialized. This is the part of the story that paleontologists are only now beginning to decode, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the dinosaur mind. In the Gobi Desert, 70 million years ago, the night did not belong to Troodon. It belonged to a different theropod, one we've already met, Velociraptor. But Velociraptor was not alone. The Gobi was a desert ecosystem, a place of extreme temperature swings where the daytime heat could kill and the nighttime cold could freeze. The dinosaurs that lived here had adapted to a world of extremes, and the night shift in the Gobi was a high-stakes game of survival that pushed the limits of sensory adaptation in ways that the northern forests never could. Because in the desert, there was no dense undergrowth to hide in. There were no towering conifers, no thick ferns, no deep leaf litter. Just open sand, bare rock, and scattered patches of vegetation clinging to dry riverbeds. In this landscape, stealth was nearly impossible. Every footstep crunched. Every shadow was sharp-edged and stark, under the bright desert moon. The night hunters of the Gobi had to solve a different problem: how to hunt when you cannot hide. Velociraptor's solution was speed and timing. Its body, as reconstructed from multiple well-preserved skeletons, was a marvel of engineering for short explosive bursts. Its legs were long and muscular, its tail stiffened for balance during rapid turns, its arms feathered and aerodynamic. It didn't creep up on its prey, it ran it down. But not in a long-distance chase. Velociraptor was a sprinter, not a marathoner, but in a lightning ambush from cover that lasted seconds. The cover, in this case, wasn't ferns. It was the terrain itself, the dips between sand dunes, the dry washes, the boulders scattered across the desert floor. Velociraptor would wait in these natural hiding spots, its mottled feathers blending into the rock and sand, and then explode into motion the moment a Protoceratops wandered too close. The attack was over in a heartbeat. If it failed, the Velociraptor retreated, because in the open desert, every failed ambush was an invitation to other predators. The Gobi night was full of them, and this is where the story takes a turn that challenges everything. Because new evidence suggests that Velociraptor did not just hunt Protoceratops. It also competed with, and occasionally hunted, other nocturnal predators. Fossil trackways, discovered in the Gobi, preserve the footprints of multiple small theropods crisscrossing the same patch of sand at night. The tracks are interleaved, suggesting that several different species were active in the same area at the same time, not peacefully, but in a state of constant competitive tension. Some of those tracks belong to a creature even smaller than Velociraptor, a creature with the proportions of a modern roadrunner. Others belong to something larger, a predator that walked on two legs but left deeper prints that suggest a body mass 30% greater than a Velociraptor. This was a night war, with multiple factions jockeying for position in a landscape where cover was limited and every hunt was a gamble. But here is the truly wild part. Some of the bones found in the Gobi, gnawed by small predators, may tell the story of what happened when one night hunter encountered another. A partial skeleton of a Velociraptor, discovered in 2010, shows tooth marks on its leg bones that match the dental profile of another Dinosaur. That's right, a raptor eaten by another raptor. Intra-guild predation, the killing and eating of competing predators, was not an occasional anomaly. It was a regular feature of the nocturnal ecosystem. The night was so crowded, so competitive, that the predators had become each other's prey. This was not a simple food chain. It was a web of fear where even the hunters were hunted. And that web is what drove the evolution of bigger brains and faster reactions. A Troodon that only worried about hadrosaurs didn't need to be as alert as a Velociraptor that also had to watch out for other raptors. The intra-guild pressure was a cognitive accelerant. We can see the evidence of this pressure in the fossilized brains themselves. The endocasts of Troodon and Velociraptor show something that stunned researchers when they first reconstructed them. The cerebellum, the part of the brain responsible for coordination and rapid motor response, is proportionally huge. In modern animals, an enlarged cerebellum is associated with high-speed aerial maneuvering. Think falcons, swallows, bats. A Troodon's cerebellum was comparable in relative size to a modern hawk. This was not an animal that plodded. This was an animal that could change direction mid-stride, leap from a standing start, and track a moving target through a cluttered environment in near total darkness. Its brain was a flight computer, but it was strapped to a terrestrial predator. The Troodon was a fighter jet that never left the ground. And its brain had another trick that we're only now beginning to appreciate. Recent high-resolution imaging of Troodon skulls has revealed enlarged regions of the forebrain associated with problem-solving and learning in modern birds. This is the part of the brain that allows crows to solve multi-step puzzles, that lets parrots understand abstract concepts, that gives ravens the ability to plan for the future. The Troodon had a proto-avian brain, millions of years before the first true birds appeared. It was, in a very real sense, thinking with the same neural architecture that you use right now to anticipate the next sentence I am about to speak. This is not poetic license. This is deep homology. The basic blueprint of the modern vertebrate brain, with its layered cortical structures and complex feedback loops, was already present in the Maniraptoran theropods of the Cretaceous, and it was refined, first and foremost, for hunting in the dark. But cognitive power is expensive. The brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the body. A Troodon's brain, proportionally larger than a modern ostrich's, would have required a constant supply of high-quality fuel. This is why the troodontids were so vulnerable to starvation. A lion can go days without eating. A shrew can only go hours. The metabolisms of these small nocturnal predators were running hot, their brains burning fuel like a supercomputer in overdrive. Every failed hunt was a step closer to collapse. And this relentless metabolic pressure explains something that has long puzzled paleontologists: the apparent paradox of the troodontid diet. These animals had teeth that were neither fully carnivorous nor fully herbivorous. They had large eyes and sharp claws, but also a beak-like tip to the lower jaw and digestive adaptations that suggest they could process plant matter. Some paleontologists have argued that Troodon was an omnivore, that it ate seeds and fruits and insects alongside meat. This makes sense if you think of it as a nighttime forager that couldn't afford to be picky. A brain that big couldn't run on meat alone. It needed a diversified energy portfolio, and the Cretaceous night provided it. The troodontids were not just hunters. They were gatherers, opportunists, survivors operating on the thinnest margins, using their intelligence not just to kill, but to find anything edible in the darkness. This versatility is what prepared their descendants for the end of the world. And to understand that, we need to move forward in time, to the very last days of the Cretaceous, and to a different kind of night. A night that would last not hours, but years. The night after the asteroid hit. The Chicxulub impact, 66 million years ago, was not just a firestorm and a megatsunami. It was a global darkness that lasted, by most estimates, between 18 months and 3 years. The dust and sulfate aerosols thrown into the atmosphere blocked out the sun so thoroughly that photosynthesis collapsed across the entire planet. The food chain crumbled from the bottom up. The large herbivores starved. The giant predators that depended on them starved. The pterosaurs, the marine reptiles, the non-avian dinosaurs, all of them went extinct. But not everything. In the darkness, in the cold, something survived. And it survived precisely because it was already adapted to a world without light. The ancestors of modern birds were small, feathered, winged Maniraptoran theropods, the cousins of Troodon and Velociraptor. They had already evolved the large brains, the acute senses, the flexible diets, and the high metabolisms that characterized the nocturnal dinosaurs. When the asteroid hit and the sun went out, these creatures were not dependent on the sun-dependent food chains that collapsed. They could scavenge seeds from the soil. They could hunt insects that fed on decaying matter. They could survive in the dark because they had been living in the dark for tens of millions of years. The night shift, in other words, inherited the earth. The day shift went extinct, and the birds you see outside your window, from the pigeon on the ledge to the owl in the tree, are the direct descendants of the nocturnal dinosaurs that survived the apocalypse because they were already built for it. This is not speculation. This is the emerging consensus of a decade of paleontological research. The genetic evidence, the fossil evidence, the comparative anatomy evidence all converge on the same conclusion. The survival of the avian lineage through the KPG extinction event was not random luck. It was the payoff of 100 million years of evolution in the dark. The asteroid did not create the birds. The night did. And the night did it by sculpting a brain that could handle uncertainty, adapt to scarcity, and outthink both its prey and its competitors. That brain, in modified form, is the brain you are using right now to listen to this story. But to fully grasp the magnitude of this legacy, we have to go back one more time to the Cretaceous night. We have to look at what happened, not just to the predators, but to the prey, because the sleeping herds of the Mesozoic were not passive victims. They were active participants in the evolutionary arms race, and their counter-adaptations were just as extraordinary as the predators' sensory upgrades. And the most extraordinary of these counter-adaptations is something we are only now, in the last 5 years, beginning to understand. It has to do with the way sleeping dinosaurs organized themselves, not just in space but in time. They didn't all sleep at the same depth. They didn't all sleep in the same posture. They didn't all sleep at the same time. The herd was not a static target. It was a dynamic, self-regulating defense system that had evolved specifically to counter the night hunters. And the most vulnerable members of the herd, the juveniles, the sick, the elderly, were protected by a rotating watch, a system of sentinel duty that may have been the most sophisticated anti-predator strategy in the history of life on Earth. This is the final piece of the puzzle, the thing that ties the entire night shift story together. And it's where we're headed next. The sentinel system of a sleeping hadrosaur herd was not a simple rotation of watch duty. It was a layered, adaptive, multi-sensory defense network that had been refined by tens of millions of years of nocturnal predation pressure. And to understand how it worked, you have to temporarily set aside everything you know about sleep and enter the neurobiology of a dinosaur that weighed more than a school bus but still dreamed. Let's start with the posture. Hadrosaurs did not lie down to sleep. Their bodies were too massive, their legs too straight, their rib cages too deep. A hadrosaur that lay down on its side would crush its own lungs under the weight of its body, so they slept standing up, not rigidly upright like a soldier on guard, but in a kind of relaxed slump, their weight distributed across all 4 legs, their necks drooping into a gentle U-curve, their tails resting on the ground as a stabilizing tripod. This posture was energy efficient and allowed for rapid awakening. A sleeping hadrosaur could be fully upright and moving within 2 seconds of an alarm call. Compare that to a modern cow, which takes 4 to 5 seconds to get to its feet from a lying position. The hadrosaurs had traded deeper sleep for faster response times. Evolution had dialed the knob toward vigilance, but posture alone was not enough. The herd needed a way to detect threats before they were close enough to strike. This is where their extraordinary hearing and seismic sensitivity came into play. Hadrosaur skulls, as reconstructed from CT scans, reveal an inner ear that was finely tuned to low-frequency sound. The cochlea, the spiral-shaped organ that converts sound waves into nerve impulses, was elongated in hadrosaurs, suggesting they could hear frequencies well below 20 Hz, infrasound, that travels through the ground and through dense vegetation. A trotodon footstep, as carefully placed as it was, generated a ground-borne vibration that propagated outward in all directions. The hadrosaur's feet, planted firmly on the soil, picked up that vibration and transmitted it through their leg bones to their inner ears. They could feel the predator approaching before they could hear it. The ground itself was an early warning system. But even this was not foolproof. A single trudon moving slowly on soft soil might not generate enough vibration to register. A coordinated pack, moving together, would generate more, but still might slip under the threshold, if they were careful enough. So the hadrosaurs had evolved a 3rd layer of defense, the sentinel rotation. Modern research on hadrosaur bone histology, the microscopic study of growth rings in fossil bones, has revealed something remarkable. Individual hadrosaurs show patterns of interrupted sleep in their bone growth, patterns that suggest they were awake at different times during the night. The herd did not all sleep at once. A subset of adults, perhaps 10 to 15%, remained awake at any given moment, their eyes open, their ears scanning, their bodies positioned at the edges of the herd. They would stand watch for an hour, maybe two, then nudge another adult awake and slip into sleep themselves. The sentinel role rotated through the herd like a slow wave, ensuring that someone was always on duty, someone was always alert, someone was always watching the darkness for the glint of an eye or the rustle of a feather. This system was not perfect. The juveniles at the center of the herd were the most protected, but they were also the most restless. Young hadrosaurs, like young mammals, needed more sleep than adults. Their bodies were growing rapidly, adding pounds of bone and muscle every week, and that growth demanded long periods of deep, uninterrupted rest. But deep sleep was dangerous. The deeper the sleep, the slower the response time. A juvenile in REM sleep, dreaming its hadrosaur dreams, was effectively paralyzed for short bursts, a phenomenon called REM atonia that occurs in all terrestrial vertebrates, from mammals to birds to, yes, probably dinosaurs. The night hunters knew this. They targeted the juveniles precisely because the juveniles were the ones most likely to be in that vulnerable state of deep unconsciousness. The arms race between predator and prey had reached into the very structure of sleep itself. And this brings us to the most astonishing part of the hadrosaur defense system, the alarm call. Hadrosaurs were not silent. Their skulls contain elaborate nasal passages and crests that were once thought to be purely for display or thermoregulation. But in the last decade, a team of paleontologists led by David Evans at the Royal Ontario Museum used computer modeling to reconstruct the acoustic properties of hadrosaur crests. They found that these crests were resonating chambers capable of producing low-frequency sounds that could carry for miles through dense forest. A hadrosaur alarm call would have been a deep, booming note, somewhere between a foghorn and an elephant's rumble, pitched low enough to travel through solid ground as well as air. When one sentinel sounded the alarm, the entire herd would be awake within seconds. And the sound itself was a weapon. It was loud enough to disorient a nearby predator, to shake the forest, and send the night hunters scattering. It was the voice of 100 million years of evolution screaming into the dark, "Not tonight." And it usually worked. This is the part of the story that often gets lost in the sensationalizing of dinosaur predation. The predators did not always win. In fact, they usually lost. A modern lion fails in 7 out of 10 hunting attempts. A modern wolf pack fails in 8 out of 10. The Troodon pack we have been following all night, the one that scattered when the tyrannosaurs arrived, that lost their opportunity when the arboreal dromaeosaur interfered, they were not unlucky. They were normal. The nocturnal hunting success rate for troodontids, as estimated from energy budget models and comparison with modern nocturnal predators, was probably around 15 to 20%. 4 out of 5 hunts ended in failure. The hadrosaur's defense system, for all its flaws, was effective enough to keep the night hunters on the edge of starvation. And that edge is what drove the evolution of everything we've been talking about: the big brain, the sharp senses, the complex social coordination. The predators had to be smarter because the prey was smarter than anyone ever gave it credit for. But let's go deeper. Because the sentinel system wasn't the only trick the hadrosaurs had. There is fossil evidence, indirect but compelling, that hadrosaurs may have deliberately chosen sleeping sites for their acoustic properties. Certain fossil bone beds, places where multiple hadrosaurs died together in a catastrophic event, like a flash flood, are located in geological formations that would have been natural amphitheaters, bowl-shaped valleys, narrow canyons, the edges of cliffs. These locations would have amplified sound and funneled ground vibrations, making it easier for the sentinels to detect approaching predators. The herd was not just sleeping together. It was sleeping in strategically chosen defensive positions, the dinosaur equivalent of circling the wagons. This is a level of landscape-scale decision-making that implies a sophisticated understanding of the environment, a mental map of safe zones and danger zones passed down through generations of herd memory. The hadrosaurs were choosing where to sleep based on how well they could hear in the dark. And the night hunters, in response, were learning to work around these defenses. This is where the intelligence arms race really accelerates. Because a Troodon pack that had hunted a particular herd before, that had been repelled by an alarm call from a particular sentinel, could remember. They could learn which approaches were too noisy, which sentinels were most alert, which juveniles were most vulnerable. They could, over successive nights, build a profile of the herd's defensive patterns and adapt their tactics accordingly. This is not instinct. This is cultural transmission. One Troodon learns something, and it teaches the others. Or they watch and imitate. Or they simply coordinate more effectively because they've been through the same failure together and their brains, wired for social learning, incorporate the lesson. The night was a classroom, and the curriculum was survival. We can see echoes of this dynamic in modern ecosystems. Wolves learn the defensive patterns of bison herds over multiple encounters, and their success rate improves the longer they hunt the same herd. Chimpanzees who hunt colobus monkeys in the Thai forest of Ivory Coast coordinate their ambushes with roles, driver, blocker, ambusher, that are assigned based on individual skill and adjusted in real time. These are not instinctive behaviors. They are learned, practiced, and culturally transmitted. And the animals doing them have brains that, in terms of basic architecture, are not fundamentally different from a Troodon's brain. The capacity for tactical learning, for adaptive group coordination, for remembering the outcomes of past hunts and applying those lessons to new situations. These capacities are ancient. They were present in the Cretaceous night, refined by millions of years of cat and mouse games between the hunters and the hunted. The more we learn about dinosaur neurobiology, the harder it becomes to draw a bright line between their cognition and the cognition of modern animals. The night shift was a thinking shift, and it left traces, not just in the fossil record, but in the deep structure of the vertebrate brain. Here is the final piece of the puzzle, the one that ties the Cretaceous night directly to you right now, listening to these words. When neuroscientists study the visual system of modern birds, the direct descendants of the Meniraptoran theropods, they find something remarkable. The avian visual system is organized around a structure called the tectofugal pathway, which processes motion, spatial location, and object recognition. This pathway is so ancient that its basic architecture is shared by all vertebrates, including humans. But in birds, it is hypertrophied, enlarged, supercharged. A pigeon can process visual information more than 3 times faster than a human. A falcon can spot a rabbit from a mile away and track it through a dive that exceeds 200 miles per hour. This is not a new adaptation. It is an old one, honed over deep time, and its roots go back to the nocturnal theropods. The visual superpowers of modern birds are the legacy of the night shift. But it's not just vision. It's the whole package. The enlarged forebrain that Troodon used for planning and spatial memory is homologous to the avian nidopallium, the structure that modern birds use for complex problem-solving. The enlarged cerebellum that allowed Velociraptor to make lightning-fast course corrections in the dark is the same structure that allows a hummingbird to hover with millimeter precision. The neural circuits that let Stenonychosaurus communicate silently with its packmates are the precursors to the sophisticated vocal learning circuits in songbirds and parrots. Every cognitive ability we admire in modern birds, tool use, episodic memory, social learning, even something that looks very much like theory of mind, was forged in the darkness of the Cretaceous, in the furnace of nocturnal predation pressure. The night made the mind. And then the asteroid struck. The day of the impact, a day in late spring or early summer. According to the latest analysis of fish gills from the Tanis fossil site in North Dakota, the world was warm and full of life. Hadrosaurs were feeding in the fern meadows. Tyrannosaurs were patrolling the coastal plains. Troodontids were sleeping in their hidden dens, waiting for the sun to set. And then a 6-mile-wide rock traveling at 45,000 miles per hour slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and everything changed. The fireball swept across the hemisphere. The megatsunami surged across the Gulf of Mexico. The ejecta blanket rained molten rock from the sky, setting forests on fire from Canada to Patagonia. And then the darkness came, not the familiar darkness of a Cretaceous night, but a choking, freezing, endless darkness that lasted for years. The sun was gone. The plants died. The herbivores starved. The giant predators starved. The entire day shift ecosystem collapsed in a geological eye blink. But the night shift endured. Not everywhere, and not all of it. Many small nocturnal species went extinct too. The ones that survived were the ones that could survive the darkness, not the darkness of a 12-hour night, but the darkness of a 3-year winter. The ones that could eat seeds from the soil, insects from rotting logs, anything that wasn't dependent on living plants. The ones that were small enough to hide, warm-blooded enough to endure the cold, and smart enough to find food in a world that had turned into a freezer. The avian ancestors. The direct descendants of the Menieraptor and theropods, the cousins of Troodon and Velociraptor and Shuvuia. They slipped through the bottleneck, and when the sun came back, they were still here. The day shift was gone. The night shift had inherited the Earth. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal evolutionary history of our planet. Every bird you have ever seen, from the sparrow on the windowsill to the eagle on the wing, is a surviving member of the nocturnal dinosaur lineage. Their brains, their eyes, their metabolisms, their very way of being in the world, were shaped by the pressure of the Cretaceous night. And the mammals, the lineage that would eventually produce humans, also survived the extinction. But we took a different path. We were already nocturnal too. Most early mammals were small, shrew-like creatures that hid in the dark to avoid the dinosaurs. But after the extinction, we diversified into the daylight. The birds, meanwhile, kept the night. The owl, the nightjar, the kiwi, the kakapo. These are the purest inheritors of the Troodon legacy. But even the day-flying birds carry the neural architecture of their nocturnal ancestors. The night is baked into their brains, just as it is, in a deeper and more distant sense, baked into yours. Because here is the final surprise. The brain structures that Troodon used to hunt in the dark are not just homologous to bird brains. They are homologous to your brain. The basic plan of the vertebrate brain, the forebrain, the midbrain, the hindbrain, the layered circuits for processing sensory information and generating motor commands. This plan was laid down more than 500 million years ago in the first vertebrates that swam in the Cambrian seas. Every vertebrate that has ever lived, including you, shares this plan. The specific elaborations of that plan, the enlarged forebrain, the hypertrophied visual processing centers, the expanded cerebellum, evolved in different lineages at different times. But the raw material, the neural toolkit, was already there in the dinosaurs, in the first mammals, in the common ancestor we share with the birds. When you close your eyes and navigate a dark room by memory and touch, you are using neural circuits that are, in their essential design, the same circuits a Troodon used to navigate a dark forest. When you startle awake at a sound in the night, your heart pounding, your senses on high alert, you are experiencing a physiological response that was honed in the Cretaceous, when the night was full of teeth and claws, and the difference between sleeping and waking was the difference between life and death. The Cretaceous night is not over. It lives on in the deep structure of your brain, a legacy you carry every time the sun goes down and the world grows quiet. You are a descendant of survivors, and the part of you that still listens in the dark is the part that remembers, deep in its ancient wiring, what the night used to be. The Troodon is gone. The hadrosaurs are gone. The great nocturnal ecosystem of the Mesozoic is dust and fossils, and the faint echo of a world that was. But the brain that hunted in that world, the brain that solved problems and made decisions and learned from its mistakes, is still here. It's just been repurposed, upgraded, given new tasks and new tools. But the night is still its natural habitat, and somewhere in the deep folds of your cortex, beneath the language and the culture and the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 generations, there is a small predator with big eyes, listening to the darkness, ready to move. It always was. It always will be. So the next time you find yourself awake in the small hours, listening to the silence of your own room, consider what you are really hearing. The faint hum of a refrigerator, the creak of settling floorboards, the distant siren that fades as quickly as it rose. These are the sounds of a world that has tamed the night. But beneath them, in the older part of your brain, the part that doesn't understand electricity or locked doors or the statistical improbability of a dinosaur entering your bedroom, there is still a vigilant presence. It has been with you since before you were human. It was forged in a world where the dark was not empty but crowded, not silent but alive with the soft padding of clawed feet and the low rumble of infrasound rolling through the soil. That world is gone, but you are not separate from it. You are its descendant, its inheritor, its living memory. The nocturnal dinosaurs are extinct. The last Troodon died 66 million years ago, probably in the months after the asteroid impact, as the global winter tightened its grip and the seeds and insects it had relied on became too scarce to sustain its energy-hungry brain. The last Chevuia, with its owl-like hearing and its nightjar eyes, perished in its desert burrow. The last velociraptor, the crepuscular assassin of the Gobi, either starved or froze or was buried alive by a sand dune, just like the fighting dinosaur's specimen that immortalized its struggle. They are all gone, and yet they are not gone. They live on in the genomes of every bird that flies, in the neural architecture of every creature with a backbone, in the deep wiring that makes you flinch at sudden movements in the corner of your eye and listen a little harder when the house settles in the dark. Extinction is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a transformation, and the transformation is still unfolding. The birds that survived the asteroid went on to diversify into the 10,000 species that fill our skies today. Some of them, like the owls and the nightjars, remained true to their nocturnal heritage, refining the sensory systems that their troodontid cousins first evolved in the Cretaceous. An owl's facial disc, that satellite dish arrangement of feathers that funnel sound into its asymmetrical ears, is a direct elaboration of the auditory system that first appeared in the Maniraptor and theropods. The nightjar's enormous eyes, so large they distort the shape of its skull, are the same solution. Troodon found millions of years earlier to the problem of hunting in the dark. The kakapo, the flightless nocturnal parrot of New Zealand, carries in its brain the spatial memory and problem-solving abilities that allowed its ancestors to navigate dense forests at night, just as Stenonychosaurus did in the Cretaceous. These are not coincidences. They are continuities. The thread of the night shift was never cut. It was merely rewoven. And then there is us. The mammals that survived the extinction took a different evolutionary path. But we did not escape our own nocturnal heritage. The earliest mammals were small, nocturnal insectivores that lived in the shadow of the dinosaurs for more than 100 million years. They evolved fur for warmth, whiskers for navigating tight spaces in the dark, and a suite of sensory adaptations that allowed them to function when the dinosaurs slept. When the asteroid hit and the dinosaurs vanished, the mammals inherited the day. But they brought their nocturnal toolkit with them. Our color vision, which is excellent by mammalian standards, is a re-evolved trait built on a visual system that had been optimized for low light. Our sleep cycles, with their alternating phases of deep sleep and REM, are a legacy of the need to stay partially alert, even while unconscious. Our fear of the dark, that primal unease that most children experience and many adults never fully outgrow, is not irrational. It is ancestral memory. It is the echo of a time when the dark really was full of predators, and the predators really were watching. And the only reason your ancestors survived long enough to become your ancestors is that they listened and feared and stayed hidden until dawn. The study of nocturnal dinosaurs is still in its infancy. Every year, new fossils emerge from the ground that force us to revise our understanding of what these animals were capable of. The discovery of Shuvuyu's extraordinary sensory abilities was published in 2021. The analysis of Velociraptor's crepuscular activity patterns was published a decade earlier. The reconstruction of hadrosaur hearing and its role in nocturnal predator defense is still being debated in paleontological journals. There is so much we don't know. We don't know how Troodon packs communicated in the dark. We don't know whether they had a language of soft calls and body postures, or whether their coordination was entirely silent and visual. We don't know what they dreamed about when they slept, or if they dreamed at all. We don't know if they played, if they mourned their dead, if they taught their young to hunt or left them to figure it out on their own. The fossil record can tell us many things, but it cannot tell us everything. And the things it cannot tell us are the very things that made these animals alive. But the gaps in our knowledge are not failures. They are invitations. Every unanswered question is a doorway into a deeper understanding of the past, and every new discovery is a reminder that the world we inhabit is built on the bones of worlds that came before. The Cretaceous night is over, but the curiosity that drives us to study it is the same curiosity that allowed our ancestors to survive and thrive. We want to know what happened in the dark because we carry the dark inside us. We want to understand the ancient predators because their story is, in a very real sense, our story. We are not separate from nature, standing outside it and looking in. We are nature, looking back at itself, trying to remember where we came from. If you've made it this far, if you've spent this time in the Cretaceous night with me, then you are already part of this ongoing act of remembering. You've let your mind wander back to a world that no longer exists, populated by creatures whose names you might not have known before tonight. You've imagined what it was like to be a Troodon, waiting in the ferns, calculating the distance to its prey. You've imagined what it was like to be a hadrosaur, standing in the darkness, listening to the ground for the vibration of approaching feet. You've imagined the asteroid, the fire, the long winter, and the small feathered survivors who carried the torch of the night shift into the new world. That act of imagination is a kind of time travel. And the more we practice it, the more we realize that the past is not a foreign country. It's home. So before you drift off to sleep tonight, take a moment, close your eyes, listen to your own breathing, feel the weight of your body against the bed. And then, if you want, let your mind wander back to that clearing in Alberta, 70 million years ago. The hadrosaurs have settled back down after the stampede. The Troodon pack has found a new target. The arboreal dromaeosaur is still watching from the canopy. The night is dark and full of movement and alive in a way that our modern world has forgotten. But you haven't forgotten. Not really. You carry it with you. The night is yours. It always was. It always will be. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the deep past, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it lets me know that you want to hear more stories from the lost worlds that made our own. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are listening from, what time it is for you, and what ancient creature you'd like to explore next. I read every one. Now close your eyes, let the night take you, and I'll see you next time in the darkness where we left off.